up on the idea that God is something that exists in the empirical realm of reality. He's a material entity. I don't believe that that's true. I think that that's what Christ is. Christ was the material manifestation of God, and he served a symbolic archetypal purpose. And that's the purpose of sacrifice. And he showed the value of sacrifice through his crucifixion. But God per se is not a material thing, you know? And so I think Kant understood that, and because Kant believed that the categorical imperative, the God concept, whatever you want to call it, is an ideal to aim your actions toward, he, on some very human level, understood, though he didn't project it outward, but he understood that living up to that categorical imperative is impossible. Living up to God's expectations is impossible. That's what free will is for. And if you accept that you're imperfect, you know, that you are born with original sin, so to speak, and that you have to constantly battle that, then you can live a life of struggle but of virtue, and that's the best you can do, you know. I don't know where else I was going to go with that, but maybe you can play off of that. But even philosophers like Wittgenstein, who's probably my favorite philosopher, wrote very little on religious belief. It's like a third of this book that I'm showing you right now. It's maybe 20 pages.
Cool.
That's all he wrote strictly on religious belief, but it's so tied in with the rest of his thought. And there are little spiritual ideas speckled throughout his philosophy, but a lot of people think that because Ludwig Wittgenstein was like a hardcore logician, that he was an atheist, just like his teacher Bertrand Russell. But I don't think that's true, because he deeply wanted to live and understand the moral life. And all the best philosophers were inclusive in that way. They thought more broadly about reality than simply logic or simply science, or simply the physical realm. There was a spiritual bent toward that, because that's where meaning is. You know, what does it mean? What does God mean? What does religion mean? Even if a philosopher is only spiritual on that level, they want to know on a philosophical level, what is God? What does it mean to live a moral life? They're likely to incorporate that into their life, and that's just their way of understanding it. That's their religion in some sense.
I'm going to briefly touch up on. I don't know if you ever heard of Jonathan Edwards.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, Jonathan Edwards was a Puritan pastor, also a philosopher, or did philosophy and stuff like that.
Sure.
But he was completely sure of his faith.
Okay.
You know, he was probably one of those philosophers like, okay, this guy's Christian. How does philosophy, even play into that?
Sure.
So my last question for the evening,
okay,
is can philosophy and religion complement one another?
Absolutely. So given the overlap between philosophy and religion, asking a lot of the bigger questions, philosophy asking the bigger questions about everything. There's a funny saying, a quotation by Dorian Sagan, Carl Sagan's son, about the difference between science and philosophy. He says the scientist learns more and more about less and less until he knows everything about nothing. And the philosopher learns less and less about more and more until he knows nothing about everything. I think that's very accurate as far as what philosophy does, or the effect that it has on your understanding of the world after you've read a bit of philosophy. You learn less and less about more and more until you know nothing about everything, until you gain a perspective that makes you realize that you can't really know everything about anything, that there are always going to be questions that you can't answer, that there's always going to be something left over that you can learn from, and that you have to incorporate that lack of knowledge into your being. You have to allow that to drive you forward and to be more curious and to be more creative and to make your life better and to make yourself better and everyone around you better. And instead of letting it dishearten you, instead of letting it repress you and turn you bitter and resentful at the world, you know?
Yeah.
And that there's a lot of that in the scientific community, that negative attitude toward religion and philosophy. But I mean, think about like what I just said. If you approach philosophy in the right way, it makes your life better. That's what religion is meant to do. But on the basis of tradition and practice and community orientation and prayer and meditation and song and all of the formalities and things that you do in a religious context, you know? So an understanding of the philosophical perspective can complement your religious life if you're religious. And an understanding of some of those traditions and practices on the religious end can give a context to your philosophical knowledge. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. Well, I want to thank you guys for listening in. This is probably my longest podcast ever.
Yay, that was my goal.
But, you know, Britton and I, we've been friends for close to 23 years. Since we were 5.
Since we were 5 or 6, yeah.
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 Well, actually, I was 5, you were 4.
That's right. Yeah, I was in little school when you came to the church, I think.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And then a couple years later, this kid that looked like Ralph off of the Christmas Story asked me to join Boy Scouts. So the purpose of this episode, you know, it's kind of a deviation away from your typical answer of questions about prayer. Sure. And I'm trying to get the listeners to basically open up with critical thinking and philosophy. Sure. So, but do you have any other closing statements you want to make?
Closing statements. Well, I do retract that my perspective is a secular one. I think we mentioned that once or twice in the beginning. I do feel a deep spiritual, I do have a spiritual inclination, a spiritual side. But as someone who is very interested in critical thinking and also very individualistic and rebellious personality-wise, I tend right. I tend away from organized religion, but I definitely, from my philosophical perspective, I don't look down on it in any way. I mean, it's something that's very useful for a lot of people and important, and I don't think that the atheists are right. I tend to side more with the Christian community than with the atheistic community. When it comes to these philosophical questions, because I find that atheists sort of miss the point about religion and spirituality in general, and a lot of them might say something like, "I'm a spiritual atheist." I'm like, I'm sorry, that doesn't work. You know.
Again, what does the word atheist mean?
Right.
You know, I said.
Well, it's a rejection of the existence of deity.
Yeah.
But they have not clearly defined what a deity is. They don't get it. Sorry. So, and I'm not saying that religious people get it either to a full degree. Not everyone anyway. But I tend to side a little more with the religious folk because at least if there is a lot of uncertainty in their faith, they're still sort of clinging on to some of these traditions and to their religious community because in the back of their minds, they know that there's something good in it. And maybe there's some reason, something that they would lose if they were to get rid of it. Right. You know? And so to take that sort of conservative approach to religion, I think is important. You don't come up with new ideas and change the whole system from the top down for the sake of it because you see one or two little things that are wrong in religious ways of thinking from a logical or scientific standpoint. That's not really the point of religion. It's an action-based thing, It's an action-based activity, and we should treat it with respect because it's a lot older than we are. So there's always something that we can learn from it.
It lasted this long.
It has lasted a long time, and it's older than we are. There's always something to learn from it. There's always something in it that we'd be missing without at least understanding. Yeah, understanding it.
Yeah. So hopefully, I reached my goal here. I was trying to get some critical thinking wheels moving here, and I think we can't coexist. Like, for example, an atheist will outright fight with a Christian. Yeah. Even if they try to share their faith with them.
They won't change their mind.
Right.
They're not going to change their mind on the basis of something the Christian person said. And vice versa. I mean, typically, even if they're both raising good points, it's one of those divisive issues where statistics actually show that the more evidence, the more good and true evidence is raised against your point, in fact, the more steadfast you become in your dogmatic belief, not less. Mm-hmm. So that's our tribal nature kicking in and kind of defending our safe space and defending our ego often. And I just think that, at the end of the day, you have to let ego go for the sake of open discussion with other human beings, regardless of what they believe or what color their skin is. And for the sake of prayer, and meditation alike. Ego is a killer. That's where your unconscious motivations are hiding, and you're not always completely aware of how they're holding you back. But I think there's a lot in religion and in philosophy and in science too, in all three of those areas that can open you up.
Right. And I close with this. In today's politics, which will get us in trouble if we even talk about it. We have to have critical thinking.
Yeah.
We have to critically think about, racism, abortion, non-religious, religious. We have to do that.
Issues.
Yeah, because if we don't, then we're going to constantly find ourselves fighting with each other.
Yeah.
We're going to literally look like the United States Congress. But anyway,
yeah.
And critical thinking is being taught less and less in secondary school,
except for community colleges, as we're finding.
Yeah, well, I mean, I tend.
Well, this is like kind of my idea. I mean, I agree 100% with what you're saying, and this was one of my ideas behind wanting to teach philosophy, and what I'm going to be starting to do either in the summer or in the fall, whenever my paperwork goes through. But I was very pleased to find that philosophy is creeping back into the curriculum in a lot of places, whereas it was kind of struggling for a while, for a couple decades, and it's making a comeback. It's making a big comeback right now, and I think that's a really good thing, because a lot of people have found religion through philosophy.
Yeah.
Some people need that very strictly logical and philosophical point of view of philosophers of the past to convince them that spirituality is worthwhile, and I have to relate that to my own experience as well, because I mean, not to say that I ever identified as an atheist, but for a while I was like, well, I guess, on an empirical level, I'm agnostic. Empirically speaking, we can't know whether or not a material God exists. But then I started to think, I was like, well, God isn't a material being. So the whole atheist, agnostic, theist discussion's stupid, So just get away from it. It's not deep enough.
Yeah.
It's just not deep enough. So I tend to avoid it because it misses the point in principle. And so for a while, I was agnostic-ish until I just started to think a little more deeply about spirituality again, and it kind of came back to me, Yeah. It has to find you,
And then I'm gonna agree with what you just said. And I'm gonna add this.
Okay.
We all know your mama.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, not all the listeners, but you should know my mama.
So Miss Eileen, I'm pretty sure prayed for you, and continues to pray for you, and probably will never stop until the day she dies.
This is juicy. She's never told me this. Please go on.
Well, she hadn't told me either, but just knowing your mom and knowing her nature, I mean,